Work and Pension Secretary Mal Stride has caused controversy with comments on mental health. In an interview with The Telegraph, he said that mental health culture has gone too far. He was giving an interview about proposals to get more people back into work. So in that interview, he also said this: "While I'm grateful for today's much more open approach to mental health, there is a danger that this has gone too far. There is a real risk now that we are labelling the normal ups and downs of human life as medical conditions, which then actually serve to hold people back and ultimately drive up the benefit bill." He also complained about the supposed ease of getting a sick note from a GP. So he said, if they go to the doctor and say, "I'm feeling rather down and bluesy," the doctor will give them on average about 7 minutes, and then on 94% of occasions, they will be signed off as not fit to carry out any work whatsoever. You have to wonder, why might the GP only have 7 minutes to see you? Might it be because they're a little bit overworked? And Mel Stride is responding to statistics which show the number of people who are out of work because of long-term sickness has increased dramatically in the last 5 years. So this is data from the ONS, which shows the top 10 types of health conditions of people aged 16 to 64 who are economically inactive because of long-term sickness. And it shows you the numbers in 2019 and the numbers in 2023. And as you can see, they've gone up by a lot. So in 2019, there were just under 1 million people who were off work with depression, bad nerves, or anxiety. That's now gone up to nearly 1.4 million. So a significant increase in just 4 years. And then for all of these conditions, you can see that the numbers have gone up: problems with legs or feet, problems with back or neck. And then you've got a generic category of mental illness. So you can see there are lots more people out of work because of long-term sickness than there were just 4 years ago. Of course, we did have a pandemic in that time. And interestingly, or you could say worryingly, the rise is being driven potentially, or very much so, in part by young people. So this chart here, which put together by the Resolution Foundation, shows the share of the population who are economically inactive due to ill health. And you've got two lines here. So one is showing you 1998 and one is showing you 2022. This is really interesting because it used to be the case in 1998 that there was a really steep curve as people got older. So when you were 20, it was very unlikely you'd be off on long-term sickness. So you can see it looks like about 1 or 2% of people. But by the time you get to 60, it's quite, well, not likely, but there's a big chance you'll be off work with sickness. So you've got nearly 20% of people. That's in 1998. Once you get to 2022, you've got a much flatter curve. So whereas before you'd have 1% of people who are 20 on long-term sickness, now you've got around 6%. So you're seeing that you've got a lot more people who are young who are on long-term sickness than used to be. So that is potentially worrying. Whether or not Mel Stride's diagnosis is correct is a different one. And on BBC Question Time this week, author Philippa Gregory responded to those statements from Mel Stride.
What was really worrying to me about the statement from the Minister for Work and Pensions today was the suggestion that there was some sort of weak-spirited malingering going on, which is, he was saying that young people were self-diagnosing with mental health issues.
Not just young people, people generally.
He specialised, his concentration was that there was this new sort of spirit of young people feeling bluesy. Was a word
What he said was an increase. There's been an increase in conversations on mental health, which has led to people effectively self-diagnosing conditions. I'm grateful for today's much more open approach to mental health, he said, but there's a danger this has gone too far.
The reason people are self-diagnosing is because they can't get an appointment with a... And worse than that, I think this is absolutely part of what we've seen happen before when Ian Duncan Smith retired from the Conservatives because they were trying to limit benefits to people with disability. And what we've got now is, I think, the suggestion that people who are mentally unwell are in fact not really that mentally unwell and that they should be out at work. And clearly, he talks about people having 7 minutes with the doctor and getting a sick note and that giving them a guaranteed pension for life. This is madness. He needs to go into a job centre and talk to the people who spend their lives trying to get people into work, trying to get reasonable adjustments for people who are unwell and trying to help people who desperately want to work, who desperately want a healthy life, who desperately want a future and some way of earning money, but are literally too unwell at the moment to do so. And we said when we went through COVID, we all said to each other in the spirit of post-COVID sympathy, there is going to be a lot of trouble with people who have spent so long in isolation and whose links with their community and their work have broken down. We're going to find it very hard with young people who haven't gone through the usual education process, with the kids who didn't do nursery, with the socialisation of the very, very young, with the apprentices who couldn't get in and have a mentor that they met every day and talked to. And we knew there would be this problem. Now there is this problem. And what we're saying is that it's not a problem at all.
You can see that answer was very much resonating, or that intervention was very much resonating with the audience. Aaron, where do you stand on this? I mean, it's clear that there are a lot more people who are off work sick, especially with mental health problems. It's clear that is affecting young people much more than it did in the recent past. What's your analysis of what's going on, and what do you think of Mel Stride's analysis of what's going on?
So the two graphs you showed, Mike, were really useful. The one in terms of breaking down who's out of work long-term by age. It's very important to say, even though amongst people in there, basically after your mid-20s, 25 to 30, it's broadly the same as 1998. Let's be honest, the difference is 1.5%. But clearly something has shifted with people in their early 20s, people entering the labour market straight out of university. Something has happened. That's inarguable. It's still very low, but something has happened. I personally think that has something to do with young people's relationship to technology, particularly mobile phones, to the housing market, to the labour market. I think if you've lived through a pandemic as a teenager, it's going to probably have had some impact on your mental health. I think that's inarguable. And I think what's really interesting for me, Michael, is the fact that older people who are long-term out of work is significantly lower than it was in the late 1990s. I would argue that's a direct consequence of the fact that we've reduced elderly poverty, particularly pensioner poverty. Of course, we're talking about people who aren't yet of pensionable age, but older people generally less likely to be in poverty than they were 25 years ago. They tend to enjoy housing security. They've got a pretty good deal in terms of housing asset prices being very healthy over the last 20 years. And of course, they're far more likely to be on the housing market. I say this stat, own property rather. I say this stat repeatedly, Michael. It's huge. The number of people in their late 30s, early 40s who rent has tripled in the last 20 years. And I think the issue of housing security is so big when we're talking about the mental health of people below 30. This is not about a few hard knocks and not being able to dust yourself off. I say this as somebody who's had depression and anxiety in the past. The reason why I had depression and anxiety is because when I lived in London, I had to move 15 times in 15 years. That broke me. That was not an experience that either my mum or my dad had any comprehension of, and they hadn't really themselves lived in particularly august surroundings. They weren't especially well off. My dad's now a taxi driver. My mum had various jobs. She was a cleaning lady at one point, but they generally enjoyed housing security. The idea for them that it was normal to move every single year, 15 years, was just outlandish. And that's now a very common experience. I'm not going to say for the majority of young people, it might be, but it's certainly a very common experience for a massive minority of young people. And so I think if you look at that profound shift in people's relationship to housing and housing security, say under the age of 35, with what we presume to be, reasonable expectations 25, 35 years ago, I think that explains a hell of a lot on mental health. Anxiety, depression are very real conditions. Personally, when I had that, it knocked me out. It took way more out of me than physical health conditions have done in the past. It's inexplicable, Michael. When you have intense depression, it is impossible to work. When you have anxiety, it is impossible to plan for the future, to do the basics. As somebody who's had depression in the past, I now isolate somebody when I think they may be getting the first signs of depression. They have very low resilience. The slightest thing upsets them. They can't do very basic things. They can't, send an email. They can't send an invoice. Those are the first warning signs. So this is a serious issue. It's happening. It's real. But this explanation of, well, they're just not as tough as people used to be, give them the housing security people used to have, and then let's see. That would be the experiment I would want to run.
You've made an association there between sort of good mental health and economic security, and I suppose an association, that goes in the opposite direction. You're more likely to get mental health problems if you haven't got economic security. Someone who disagrees was on the panel on Question Time, Liddle. You might have heard of him. He hasn't got the nicest of histories. He said this about mental health.
We do have a problem in this country with mental health. It's not particularly something associated with poverty. It's something associated with anomie and alienation, and we've become a far, far less communal country.
I mean, the way you put
50,
it in
years.
A few years ago, Rod, was not quite that. You said, we live in a perpetual tizzy about our nation's mental health, largely as a consequence, I suspect, of us all being too affluent and comfortable, and not having enough other stuff to worry about.
OK, if you want me to address that rather than the question, I'll do that.
Well, no, it's obviously, it's just you saying you think it's the issue is about anomie and other matters.
Well,
I'm just saying this is
about anomie.
This was just another.
Yeah, I do think it's about anomie. Well, do you know what country has the worst mental health in the world? Monaco, the richest country in the world. And if you go down the list, you will see that the countries with the worst mental health, i.e. the most referrals, the most therapists, the most psychiatrists who people who see psychiatrists per capita, Monaco, Netherlands, Norway, Belgium, we're in the list as well, but a bit further down. So it's affluence. So there is a link between affluence and the kind of introspection which comes about as a consequence.
There might be a sliver of insight in what he said there. I don't want to completely deny that, but the statistics he used were nonsense, right? To say that Norway has the worst mental health in the world because they have the most therapists, because they have the most people being treated for depression, is just so stupid. That is such bad statistics, right? The fact that they have more therapists, the fact that they have more people being treated for depression probably has a lot more to do with the fact that they can afford it, right? They can afford the kind of healthcare that provides those services. And actually, if you look at a more, I suppose, reasonable statistics or a reasonable way of measuring people's happiness, Norway actually tends to be one of the happiest, right? So often you get these surveys where they ask people about life satisfaction. How satisfied are you with your life? And it is those Nordic countries that come top, and the countries that come bottom. I mean, at the moment, I think it's Afghanistan and Lebanon. So if you've got a country that has civil strife, that has civil war, or severe poverty, then people tend to not be so satisfied with their lives. Now, it's not a one-to-one ratio. So you will get some very poor countries where you've got good social cohesion, you've got a sort of peaceful environment, you might have relative sort of equality, and then you might have sort of decent life satisfaction. But in general, there is a correlation between wealth and life satisfaction. And the idea that you measure, the country with the best mental health is the country with the least therapists, is the country with the least people on antidepressants, is one of the most stupid things I've ever heard sort of spoken from the Question Time platform. And there's good competition, right? There were also some people in the audience who weren't impressed by Liddle's point.
I'm a medical student, we all are, and we see day in, day out people who have a really rubbish situation at the moment because they can't afford food for their kids to put on the table. They've not got a job because there isn't the jobs up here because the Tory government haven't invested money up here. It's ridiculous that you think poverty has nothing to do with mental health.
It isn't. It isn't. If you look at the figures, it's nothing to do with it at all.
I see people day in, day out who struggle with their mental health.
It just doesn't correlate. Some of the poorest countries in the world have some of the highest levels of social solidity and social togetherness and the lowest mental health problems. It's sorry.
Again, the way he sort of feigns, sorry, I'm the guy with the statistics. You might have your anecdotes as a medical student, but I have looked at the statistics and it is the Norwegians who take the most antidepressants, and therefore they are the people with the worst mental health in the world. Now, he's using a completely ridiculous data point. And then he sort of has this smugness to say, I'm the social scientist here. Now, I actually really like social science. I actually do think it is important to look at data as well as anecdote. And I think that often anecdotes do get it wrong. And if you look at the data, you might have a different perspective. But he is working from a sort of a knowledge base, which is just not very good. That medical student wasn't the only health professional in the audience.
I'm a therapist. I work in a school. so I know what I'm talking about. Rod, if you think this is nothing to do with poverty, can I suggest that you live in poverty for 6 months and I will give you a free psychotherapy session and we'll chat about your mental health. It's absolutely everything.
I'm sorry, but it's not about poverty. Here's the thing. As our country has got more affluent, we have 40-fold more therapists and psychiatrists than we had in the 50s. And I think it's something like 8 times as many as we had.
And the population is much larger.
Sorry, just let me finish. And 8 times as many as we had in the 1990s into 2000. You know, many, many more. It's been a huge growth industry.
It's been a huge growth industry. It's completely bizarre. You know, all other growth industries, probably people who teach people how to sing. That's not because we become worse singers who need more corrections, right? It's because we are a wealthier society which can afford these kind of things. There are more referees. That means that people must do more fouls and we must become more aggressive people. No more people are playing football, right? It's stupid. You sort of get that smugness of you might have frontline knowledge. You might be a doctor. You might be a healthcare professional. But I've looked at the stats and we've increased the number of therapists we have as we've got richer. And therefore I can deduce that as we've got richer, we've also got sadder. Stupid.